October 1907. New York's banks are collapsing. J.P. Morgan locks the doors and declares himself America's savior. The story everyone tells you is a lie. For over a century, the narrative has been ironclad. A financial panic swept through the United States in the autumn of 1907. Banks failed. The stock market hemorrhaged value. Depositors lined the streets demanding their money. And then J.P. Morgan, the titan of American finance, stepped in. He gathered the nation's richest men into his Manhattan mansion. He coordinated a private bailout. He stopped the bleeding. He saved capitalism itself. That's the story taught in business schools. That's the story Morgan himself promoted. But the specifics tell a different tale. Panic didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the product of 3 years of speculation, margin buying, and reckless lending that followed the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. Speculators had inflated railroad stocks and industrial securities far beyond their actual value. Margin calls had begun in August 1907. By September, the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the nation's largest, faced a run. Its president, Charles Barney, had invested heavily in copper stocks. Those stocks collapsed. Depositors wanted out. On October 22, 1907, Knickerbocker's doors closed. Within hours, the panic spread like contagion. Trust companies failed. Stock prices fell 20% in a matter of days. The New York Stock Exchange itself threatened to shut down. Money disappeared from circulation. Businesses couldn't meet payroll. It looked, for a moment, like the entire financial system might collapse into void. This is where Morgan enters the official story. The 70-year-old banker was dining with friends when he received word of the crisis. He returned to his library. He began making calls. He summoned the nation's wealthiest financiers, James Stillman of National City Bank, George Baker of First National Bank, and others. They gathered at his mansion on Madison Avenue. Behind closed doors, they pledged hundreds of millions of dollars to prop up failing institutions. The press celebrated him as a savior. Editorials praised his patriotism. Morgan had allegedly put aside personal profit to rescue the nation. The panic subsided. The stock market stabilized. By November, credit flowed again. The official account, one man's decisiveness prevented economic collapse. Morgan himself encouraged this interpretation. He granted interviews. He shaped the narrative. But examine what actually happened. Morgan didn't act out of civic duty. He acted out of self-preservation. Morgan's own banks held massive securities portfolios. A systemic collapse would have destroyed his personal wealth. The panic threatened his assets directly. His rescue was a rescue of himself first. More importantly, the banks Morgan assembled weren't acting altruistically. They were buying failed institutions at pennies on the dollar. They were acquiring assets at distressed prices. When the panic subsided, they owned more of the financial system than before. Morgan and his associates didn't just stop a crisis. They consolidated power while doing it. The public money angle complicates the picture further. The U.S. Treasury, under Secretary George Cordeleau, released $35 million in government funds to stabilize the banking system. That's federal money, taxpayer money. It underwrote Morgan's operation, yet Morgan received the credit. The Treasury's role was minimized in contemporary accounts. Here's the harder question. Did Morgan's actions actually prevent collapse, or did they simply delay the inevitable and make the next crisis worse? The panic of 1907 was severe but short. Markets recovered. But the underlying problems, speculation, inadequate regulation, concentrated power in a few hands, remained untouched. In fact, Morgan's dominance created a new danger. By consolidating so much financial authority in private hands, by proving that one man could stabilize markets through personal networks and backroom deals, the system became dependent on his judgment. When Morgan died in 1913, just 6 years later, that dependency became a liability. The real lesson of 1907 wasn't that a great man saved the system. It was that the system was fragile and prone to collapse because it lacked institutional safeguards. It relied on the goodwill and self-interest of a handful of wealthy individuals. That's not stability. That's a house of cards dressed up as architecture. The panic of 1907 directly led to the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. But that wasn't Morgan's doing. It was a response to the very conditions he'd temporarily masked. Congress realized that private bankers couldn't be trusted as the sole guardians of financial stability. A central bank was necessary. So did Morgan save the financial system? Technically, yes. Did he do it for the reasons the public believed? No. Did his actions address the root causes of the panic? Absolutely not. He was a symptom of the disease, not the cure. He applied a tourniquet while the patient was bleeding out, then declared himself a physician. The moral is sharper than it first appears. We mythologize individual actors to avoid confronting systemic failures. Morgan became a hero because it's easier than admitting the system itself was rotten. It's easier than asking why a private citizen should have that much power. It's easier than demanding structural reform. This pattern repeats. In 2008, we credited or blamed individuals, Bernanke, Paulson, Geithner. We made it personal. We missed the structural vulnerabilities that allowed the crisis to happen in the first place. We do this because stories about great men are more satisfying than stories about broken institutions. The real story of 1907 isn't about Morgan's brilliance or generosity. It's about the fragility of a system built on trust between the powerful, with no safeguards for anyone else. It's about how crises get weaponized by those with resources to exploit them. It's about how we celebrate the firefighter while ignoring the arsonist. Morgan died in Rome in 1913, still celebrated as a savior. The Federal Reserve, created partly to reduce dependence on men like him, was already in operation. Yet his legend persisted. It still does. We remember the rescue. We forget the cause. We forget that stopping a crisis isn't the same as fixing what caused it. Subscribe. We're documenting the financial catastrophes that